$4 trillion. Say that number out loud and it still does not sound real. It is more than the annual economic output of every country in Africa combined, more than the GDP of Germany, more than what most governments on Earth will spend in the next 5 years. That is what one man left behind when he walked out the door. But here is the part that changes everything. When he walked in, the number was 350 billion, and the world was not celebrating him. The world was waiting for him to fail. Because the man who built Apple into the most valuable company in the history of money was not a visionary, not a designer, not anyone you would have looked at in 2011 and said, "That is the man who is going to do something no company has ever done." He had one idea. Most people missed it until it was already finished. What that idea was, and why it was so easy to miss, is the part of this story that changes everything you think you know about how Apple actually got here. This is not just a story about a company growing large. This is a story about what happens when the world is measuring the wrong thing. While everyone spent 15 years waiting for the next revolutionary product, Tim Cook was assembling a different kind of engine entirely. One that did not need a spotlight. One that made more money every month without requiring a new invention. And one that, by the time the world understood what it was, had already made Apple untouchable. 1998. Apple is 3 years removed from near bankruptcy. Steve Jobs has returned and done the brutal work. He slashed the product line, cut expenses, rebuilt the design culture. But Apple still had a problem draining money every single day, and it was not a design problem. Inventory was sitting in warehouses for 30 days at a time. In the technology industry, 30 days of unsold product means it is already aging before a customer touches it. Prices drop, components shift, competitors move. Every day of that sitting stock is money disappearing without a transaction. Jobs understood product. He did not have time to rebuild the machinery underneath it. So he called Tim Cook. Cook was 37. 12 years at IBM moving products through supply chains across multiple continents. Then North American operations at Compaq. Not a household name. Never held a product under a spotlight. Jobs offered him a seat at a company the industry had largely written off. Cook took a pay cut and moved to California. He went directly to work on the thing nobody else wanted to touch. Within 1 year, Apple's inventory dropped from 30 days to 2 days. 2 days. The financial picture shifted almost immediately. The cost of holding product had nearly disappeared. Cook had not launched anything. He had not announced anything. But Apple's margins were moving in the right direction before the iMac had even finished its first year on shelves. This is the first time Cook changed Apple's trajectory without the public noticing. It would not be the last. The iPod launched in 2001. The iPhone in 2007. The iPad in 2010. Every one of those products reached stores on time, in volume, at the margins Jobs needed, because of the supply network Cook had spent years building. Apple did not own the factories. It owned the relationships and the forecasting precision that told partners exactly what to build, how much, and when. Apple was scaling faster than almost any consumer company in history, and the infrastructure beneath that scale held every single time. But the world was watching Jobs, and that meant when Jobs stepped back, the assumption was that the engine would slow with him. On August 24, 2011, Jobs sent a short letter to Apple's board. He was resigning. His recommended successor was Tim Cook. 42 days later, Jobs was dead at 56. Before he died, Jobs had given Cook one instruction: not about products, not about design pipelines. Jobs had watched Disney spend years paralyzed after Walt died, every executive inside it asking the same question. What would Walt have done? He told Cook directly, "Never ask what I would do. Just do what is right. Refuse that trap entirely." Cook heard it. Then he walked into the most publicly scrutinized CEO transition in the history of the technology industry. With a market cap of roughly $350 billion and an industry full of analysts who believed that number was about to head in one direction: down. The coverage said it plainly. Cook was capable. Cook was disciplined. But Apple without Jobs was like a band without its songwriter. The magic was personal. It could not be transferred. The question was not whether Apple would plateau. The question was when. Cook sat with that coverage. Then he went to work. That gap between what the analysts were measuring and what Cook was actually building is the center of this entire story. Most business reporting in 2011 was focused on product launches, the next iPhone, the next big announcement. Whether Cook could stand on a stage the way Jobs had, those were the visible metrics. Nobody was writing about what was happening underneath the product layer, because from the outside, it did not look like anything was. Tell us in the comments. When you think about Tim Cook's 15 years at Apple, what is the first thing that comes to mind? We read every single one. We always reply. Now back to what Cook was actually doing. Because the move that changed everything did not come with an announcement. It arrived one subscription at a time. Here is what the analysts had missed. They were measuring Cook against the wrong model. The question they were asking was whether he could build the next iPhone, but that was never Cook's question. His question was different, and it was more valuable. He was asking, how do we make the iPhone worth more to the person who already owns it? The answer was not a new device. Consider what Apple had by 2011. Hundreds of millions of people owned Apple devices running a closed operating system. They connected to an app store Apple controlled entirely. They synced data to cloud storage Apple managed. They were already inside an Apple ecosystem without having consciously chosen to be. They had bought a phone and found themselves living in a platform. Cook understood exactly what that meant financially. A product sells once, the customer pays, and the transaction ends. But a platform collects revenue every month from the same customer automatically, without requiring a new product to be designed, manufactured, or launched. The customer is already there. The only question is how many reasons they have to keep paying. Cook began building those reasons, one at a time, starting in 2014. Apple Pay launched that year, a small percentage of every transaction made through an iPhone. Apple Music launched in 2015, a monthly subscription to stream music on a device people already owned. iCloud storage expanded into a tiered subscription model. The App Store, already generating billions, was pushed further. None of these were announced as a unified strategy. Each one appeared to be a standalone product. But they were not standalone products. They were layers on a recurring revenue engine being assembled piece by piece while the public waited for the next hardware announcement. And because they were invisible as a system, because no one keynote ever said, "Here is the real plan," almost nobody recognized what was being built until the revenue numbers made it impossible to miss. 2016. Cook removed the headphone jack from the iPhone 7. The backlash was immediate and organized. Tech reviewers called it arrogant. Consumers were angry. Apple had used the word courage in its own explanation. Critics turned that word into a punchline that lasted years. But Cook had not removed a port. He had forced a transition. Without a headphone jack, the natural move for most iPhone users was wireless audio. AirPods launched the same month. Early reviews were skeptical. The price was high. The use case felt niche. Within 18 months, AirPods were among the fastest-growing consumer hardware products on the market. Within 2 years, every major competitor had built a wireless earbud to chase the category Apple had pushed open. AirPods were generating more annual revenue than many of the companies that had spent 2 years publicly mocking them. But the product itself was only part of the picture. AirPods connected exclusively to Apple devices. They synced through Apple software. They pulled users toward Apple Music rather than a competitor's streaming service. Every pair sold was also a thread pulling the customer further into the platform Cook had been assembling for 5 years. This was the pattern across every decision in that period. The watch tracked health data that lived in Apple's ecosystem. Apple TV Plus, launched in 2019, added another monthly subscription to the stack. Apple Arcade, Apple Fitness Plus. Each new service added a layer to a structure that made leaving Apple genuinely costly, not just inconvenient. The data, The habits, the subscriptions, the purchase history, all of it was inside the walls Cook had been building. In August 2018, Apple's market value crossed $1 trillion. The first American company in history to reach that number. Cook sent a short note to employees. He thanked them. He reminded them that the number was not the destination. Then he kept going. $2 trillion in August 2020, $3 trillion in June 2023, the first company in history to close above that mark at the end of a trading day. And on April 19, 2026, when Cook announced his departure, Apple stood at $4 trillion. The same analysts who had questioned his appointment in 2011 were writing pieces about his legacy. When the coverage of Cook's departure arrived, most of it focused on the hardware story: the iPhone, the watch, the AirPods. The M-series chips Apple developed in-house to replace Intel, one of the most consequential engineering decisions of the past decade. All of that is real, but the number underneath those products tells a different story. By the time Cook stepped down, Apple's services division was generating over $100 billion a year, recurring revenue. Money that arrived every month from customers who had made their decision years earlier and had no clear reason to leave. That division alone, separated from everything else Apple sells, would rank among the most valuable businesses on Earth. Jobs had built a company people loved. Cook had built a company people could not easily leave. Those are not the same achievement. And when you look at the $4 trillion number, the second one is doing more of the work. Cook's successor is John Ternus, Apple's Senior Vice President of Hardware Engineering, 25 years at the company. Cook passed him the same 6 words Jobs had once passed to Cook: "Never ask what I would do. Just do what is right." The pattern running through this entire story is not complicated. Tim Cook never tried to be the most visible person in the room. He tried to be the most prepared one. He did not build the next iPhone. He built the structure that made every iPhone after it worth more than the one before. And he did it through a series of decisions that, taken individually, looked small. Taken together, they produced something no single product announcement ever could. Jobs built what people wanted to own. Cook built what people wanted to stay inside. The trap most people fell into was assuming that the biggest moves in business look like the biggest moments: the stage, the spotlight, the applause. Cook's most consequential decisions had none of that. They came with a product name, a price, and a subscription checkbox. And quietly, year by year, they changed the number. $4 trillion, 15 years. One idea the world kept calling the wrong thing. That is the story of Tim Cook's Apple. And the most important part was the one almost nobody saw coming. If this story made you think differently about how companies actually build lasting value, there is a comment waiting for your take below. We read them all. And there is another story, already on this channel, that works exactly the same way. Something the public record shows clearly, something that almost nobody has been told in full. Find it when you are ready.